Hello, another day, another tournament hero guide. Today we'll be talking about Lucca. I think he's the second weakest hero, with Alin being the weakest one. However, the power gap between them is actually pretty big. Alin is really just a very bad hero right now. I don't recommend Lucca for new players because it's very hard to do well with him, and most of the time you will end up with a no ability hero. It takes lots of experience to really know how to make use of his ability. Lucca's ability is on turn, steal one resource. This is pretty simple, and it leaves the power in your opponent's hands. This means it is possible for them to play around it by spending all resources and making your ability useless. This being at your opponent's mercy is why I think his ability is pretty bad, just like Alien. However, unlike Alien, at least it forces your opponent to spend their resources unoptimally, so there are ways for you to strategize based on that fact. When drafting with Lucca, you typically want to put your opponent in an annoying situation. They either spend their resources and won't have them to deal with whatever you throw at them later, or they don't and you get to steal something. This brings me to my next point regarding how to play against Lucca. I said that he's the second weakest hero in tournaments, yet oddly enough, he's the best hero to play against inexperienced players once you know how to draft with him. The reason is most of them will keep spending all their resources and shoot themselves in the foot in the process. I've seen people spending lots of food to heal themselves instead of waiting for a proper food sink just because they don't want me to steal one of their precious food, or buying cards like Repop turn 1 because me stealing 1 gold is somehow worse than them wasting 5 gold. Guys, his ability says steal 1 resource. 1, not all. So if you have lots of resources, it might be a good idea to let him steal one of them and keep the rest until you have a better way to spend them. You might think you have denied him his ability, but in reality, he's just sitting there laughing because you're doing all the hard work for him. Of course, there are times when spending all of your resources is the right play to make, but that situation isn't as common as you would think. A general rule of thumb when playing against Lucca is when you're in doubt, just let him steal something. Statistically, it's the right choice to make. And even if it's wrong, him stealing 1 resource just won't straight up cost you the game. Just pretend that he has a Shepherd's Gift on his board and an embargo on his hand. Another tip I have for you is if there's a certain resource you don't want him to steal, but you also don't want to or can't spend, simply increase the number of other resources you have so he has less chance to steal that one. The most obvious way is by playing all your coins to increase your gold amount. Lucca is among the worst heroes to have lucky with. It could work with the right strategy, but other than that, it's pretty useless. As I said before, it's entirely possible for your opponent to play around Lucca's ability, so having another card that they can play around just won't really do anything meaningful for you. Doubling down on the resource denial could work, but there are better ways to do that than blindly picking Lucky. Think carefully before you decide to pick Lucky so that you won't end up with a useless card in your deck. There are quite a few good cards on Lucca. The first and most obvious one is Brigand. That being said, even it has some problems since you need multiple brigands out to really do any sort of significant damage. And you need to protect them on top of that, so it's very hard to pull off in practice. For resource denial strategy is still much better than Lucky, Cut Purse, Embezzle, Robbery, and Sabotage, since it actually does something when your opponent doesn't have any resources, which will very often be the case when you're playing Lucca. The next good card on Lucca is Embargo. Just like Brigand, this card actually does something when your opponent has no resources. It is also the best card to counter heroes with +1 resource on turn ability. This card basically puts them in a very tough spot. They either keep some resources now and let you steal one and embargo destroy one, or they spend all of them and won't see their on turn ability do anything on their next turn. Next is usury. Normally, this card is more of an econ card for you than a resource denial card for your opponent, since it's only a net loss of 2 for them, and it takes 4 turns for the minion loss to kick in. Not on Lucca though. With his ability, usury becomes minus 3 gold for them per turn if they decide not to spend that gold, which means it only takes 3 turns for it to be a net loss for them, and the total net loss is now 4 instead of 2. If they decide to spend all of the usury gold immediately, they will practically be unable to buy any card for the next 4 turns since their gold will be in negative range. This means as long as you can handle whatever cards they play using the initial usury gold, you have free reign in the match for the next 4 turns. This card combos extremely well with the previously mentioned cards and also Merchant of Time. If you have all of them at the same time, there will be no initial plus gold for your opponent. This card would become minus 2 gold for your opponent for 3 turns. Putting your opponent in this kind of situation can be game winning at times, since they won't be able to buy any card. There are other resource denial cards in the game that, while combo well with it in theory, in practice they need a usury on the board to actually do anything, so they can be very inconsistent if you decide to play them. Unlike Pregan, Embargo, and Merchant of Time, all of which will do something regardless if you have usury or not. This card is an auto pick on Lucca. The next good card on Lucca is Guthrag's Midden. Since your opponents are more likely to spend lots of resources against Lucca, Midden will let you gain those resources even without his ability. This card pretty much pays for itself in less than 2 turns on Lucca. It's pretty close to being an auto pick, but I think it's not that impactful compared to usury. The next good cards on Lucca are tanky allies. By tanky, I mean those with 3 or more health. Since your opponents will be spending all their resources, they won't have them to kill these things off when you put them on the board. I often win with Lucca by holding a general in hand, then dropping it after clearing my opponent's board, and them having no resources since they wasted them all away. Of course, you won't be able to do this against more experienced players, but at least you'll be able to steal something since they have to keep their resources to deal with your tanky allies. Therefore, by picking tanky allies, you're enabling Lucca's ability. Wars, especially those that are tanky and can be healed up, are good on Lucca. With these wars, you could run squishy allies and the result would be the same as running tanky allies, unless you're playing against Zalia. However, this kind of strategy is a bit less consistent than simply going with tanky allies, since you would need 2 cards, a war and a useful ally, as opposed to just 1 card in tanky allies. Apothecary and Golem is a pretty nice combo since it forces your opponent to stock more than 6 resources if they want to kill your other stuff, which is not an easy thing to do against Lucca. Again though, that's at least 3 cards, so it's not very consistent. There is no specific strategy to go with on Lucca when it comes to deck building. Most of the time, you will go with a generic deck that has some good cards on Lucca. It's important to note that you want both Econ and Control with him since he provides none. It's best to assume that your ability will be useless most of the time when playing Lucca and draft with that in mind. Here are some 8 new decks I've had with Lucca. Next, I will show you one of my drafts on Lucca with commentary. In this first pack, I have Marshal, Stolen Plans, and Assassin to consider, but Assassin needs some kind of skull gain to really do anything useful. Stolen Plans is okay, I guess, but it depends on my opponent's deck. So I go with Marshall, since I'm most likely going to play with some allies when I'm playing with Lucca. Here we have Wench and Lead the Charge. Lead the Charge is okay as a control card, but it's quite expensive. And as Lucca, I don't think I could afford it very reliably, so I go with Tavern Wench. Okay, here we have a very good choice in Bishop. It's a tanky ally, and it works well with Marshall. Okay, next we have Merchant of Time, which is also a very nice card since I have 3 allies already, and with Merchant of Time, I could scale very fast. Here I have Palisade, which is a good wall to protect my Wench and Marshall. Here we have a pretty easy pick in Seduce. Okay, here we have another ally, and since all the other cards are not great, Catapult is the choice. Next we have a very good card in Overseer, because it combos extremely well with all the other allies that I have so far. Next we have 2 choices, Militia and Brute. Both would be very good options here, but since I have food generation with Bishop, I think having a way to spend those food into damage would be nice, so I go with Militia. And here, finally, we have 2 econ cards in Ransack and Usury, but Usury is simply a much better card on Lucca, and since I already have Merchant of Time to combo with it, it's obviously the better choice. Before Usury, this deck would be okay, but not great, because I have lots of expensive cards, and I wouldn't be able to afford most of them without Usury. But now, with Usury, suddenly this deck looks so good. And of course, I ended up with an 8-0. My final verdict on Lucca is he's not a good hero, especially for new players, since it's very hard to make a good deck with him compared to many other heroes in tournament. You can still win games with him, of course, but if you play against experienced players who know how to handle his ability, you will start to see his shortcomings. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.